The case of the cave humanoid. Very rarely in the field of research am I confused by a piece of evidence. It is easy to mete out what is genuine or not, properly interpreted or improperly interpreted. But in late April 2017, I was presented with a piece of evidence that confused me so greatly that I believe sharing it with the public might help relieve the stress of explaining it. The backstory is nearly as chilling as the evidence, so be prepared for the release of something truly creepy. All I can say is I'm presenting it, and you make out of it what you will. I will give you every bit of my exploration into explaining. Ultimately, you either digest this information or move on. I have no personal agenda other than to help the public to see things you don't have access to in order to understand our universe better or to work your skills at evaluating evidence. It is always my hope that someone else has maybe encountered such a thing, and this may shed light on this unexplained entity. With all these disclaimers in place, let me begin. Don Monroe, an adventurer, explorer, and researcher, at it for at least 60 years, was hiking around a 50-square-mile region in the northwestern United States that he tended to survey repeatedly for decades, always looking for changes, taking footprint castings, performing back-and-forth exchanges with those who might dwell inside of caves. As an extremely experienced hunter and tracker, Don lives for every moment in the great outdoors, especially the places the humans don't go. He has had many amazing finds over the years, daring to poke, prod, crawl, and climb where others would not think to explore. This one particular time in the early 2000s, he found a dead bird that had been eaten, the left wing intact and the blood fresh. He continued to hike on. He found a place where someone had knelt down and put their right hand in the sand and used their left hand to dig a hole deep down into the water. The handprint was most unusual in that it had very long fingers, but being in sand, not something that he could easily cast. He followed along to find another fresh bird kill in the same manner with the left wing intact. While he puzzled over it, he noted an obscure shadow in the rocks and inspected it to find a stair-step-like descent into a cave that he had never seen. One that had been so hidden no one would have found it there. If he hadn't approached it from that angle, he would have easily missed it. For 11 years, he had passed 50 yards from the cave and never saw it. In fact, this time he had to be 10 feet away to see the 30-foot by 12-foot high entrance. Within, Don found a large cavernous room with an ancient fire pit surrounded by yellowed bones. The first thing that came to mind is something from the Ice Age. The fire pit area was obviously very old. There were signs of yet another dead bird, and so whoever had been killing and eating the birds recently had been in the cave. He was cautious, wondering if there was a vagrant person within. Feeling he had enough sense of the unusual hidden cave, he left. It would be almost 6 months later when Don finally solved the mystery of who to trust to go in there with him and do a thorough review. It was a researcher he knew who was in his 80s and said he wanted to go on one last adventure, searching for hidden clues. Don debated if the man could make it. He had a bad hip, and he would need to use 2 canes to maneuver. But Don had hiked with him before and knew his capabilities, so he offered for this researcher, Massey, to go with him. He didn't realize at the time just what they would come upon together, and that what Massey would endure alone would change him for the rest of his days. Don relayed to me, "After I found this cave, I knew I had to go back, but I wasn't going to do it alone. I needed someone to document and witness, but who? I thought about it a few months before it dawned on me the ideal person to trust with this hidden cave." Then Don stopped relating the story and told me he was going to text me a picture, and then we would talk again. "Get ready for the picture. It's in the cave," he wrote. Get ready for this picture. That cautionary statement made me puzzle. I expected to see a photo to pop up on my phone screen of a cave in all its shadows and the light of a flash bouncing off stone walls like most cave photos that researchers send. What came up on my cell phone was so shocking and confusing that I immediately sent it from my phone to my email account so that I could pull it into the computer's big screen and study it. It could not possibly be what it looked like. What he sent me I thought was a mistake at first. It was far too close and too clear. There was no mistaking red hair and an eye gazing back, but it looked so foreign. As an artist, I recognized the facial landmarks were wrong. The shape of the eyelids were nothing like ours, or any other creature I could think of. I promptly studied the photo to explain it away, as it is exceedingly hard to impress me with evidence, and evidence this clear is almost never obtained. Then I suddenly called him back. "Don, how the hell did you get this? Did you encounter this? What is it? Where is it?" My mind was racing so much the questions spilled out of me rapid fire. Don took a breath and proceeded to continue his explanation. He had chosen a researcher to go with him, someone who had gone on many treks with him and was as curious about the world and nature as he was. The researcher would be the one to capture one of the most stunning and confusing bits of evidence I have ever seen. Well, here's what he sent me. I was repeating myself again. What is this? The photo looked in odd perspective, so I turned it upside down in case perhaps he sent it in the wrong orientation, and suddenly I got a chill. Don mentioned, I have no idea what it is. I found it on a camera from that trek. And so I will now explain what Don conveyed to me, the amazing series of events surrounding the photo capture of a cave being that he had come to call Rascal, and I myself call the Massey Man. Don wanted to come back to the cave, but not alone. Finding someone he trusted with an obscure, unknown cave was a riddle, but he did know another researcher who was rather fearless, although elderly. He asked him, and his friend said he'd go. Together they headed out, his friend utilizing 2 canes for his bad hip to get a good ground while he stepped down into the cave. When they arrived within, the bones around the fire pit were gone. Don frowned. Someone else had to have been there. This was not the first time he had found bones in a cave, and then as soon as he viewed them, someone took them away. It was a repeated theme throughout the caves he studied. There was also a large bird of some kind postured as if it had sat down and died, leaving its bones intact. Then as they came further, the men found a handprint. The fingers were 8 inches long. The thumb and the pinky seemed to be the same length. I'll be damned, Don had exclaimed. Same as the print I found not far from here where someone was digging down into the water. The researcher Massey offered to stay and guard the handprint while Don went to get casting material. Don left his friend with a light that blinks red and blue, a disposable camera, and Massey had 2 guns with him as well as his canes. Don returned almost an hour later to find Massey was quite shaken, pale, and agitated. The man rapidly explained that the fellow of the cave was there, a yard and a half away from him, staring him down almost the whole time Don was gone. He was 7 feet tall and no more hairy than an Italian, Massey claimed. Massey went on to describe some features. The being's legs were hairy, but the hair on the body was sparse, not solid-looking. He was built like the Arm & Hammer fellow in the arms. Massey said he was protecting the handprint from the creature, and it didn't seem to be intimidated by him, even when the researcher cursed at him like a sailor. He warned him he had 2 guns and tossed out expletives, determined to protect the find. The World War II vet was ready to stand his ground. But the being never flinched and remained there, observing him, perhaps sizing up the canes and the age of him, and realizing he wasn't a threat in the cave. In a rattled state and with a visible shudder, Massey mentioned to Don that he did not ever want to see those red eyes again. The being also made no sounds, no vocalizations, it just stood its ground. As Don finished the cast of the handprint, Massey studied the area around them cautiously. When they exited the cave, the old man clicked his canes against the rocks loudly to try and scare it off, so it wouldn't come after them. It was obvious by the armed war veteran's actions that he had guns, but he was not willing to use them unless seriously provoked. After all, even though he couldn't explain what this being was, it was in the human family, and Massey was in its home. When they left the cave following that in 2002, Massey never would go back again. He refused. He was quite shaken by the experience. A photo was taken of him right after the encounter, and you can see the terror in his face. Don took the bag with all their supplies from the excursion and dropped it off in his cabin. His life got preoccupied because his wife was dying. Following her death, Don proceeded to go on many expeditions around the world and had brief times in the cabin in which he was usually cutting firewood and keeping it warm, as well as hunting. He went back many times to see the status of the cave and record what he found there. Massey passed away in 2007. Years later, Don settled in for a long stay in the cabin to root through his items to make sense of his space. It was then that he came across the bag with all the items still in it from the expedition, including the red and blue blinking light and the extra casting material. He saw the camera had been used with some shots taken, so he had them developed to see that 2 of them were blank and completely dark, but one, however, was this infamous shot above. It would appear that likely Massey pointed and aimed, hoping to capture something in the shot or intimidate and scare. The blue light that was blinking in the cave might have reflected in the pupil, and the light from the camera could be reflected as well. I'm reminded of how many people happen upon evidence that aren't out seeking fame or fortune, or feeling they must produce evidence. It's the one in obscure places, poking around curiously, who come across the most amazing finds, and then they fear retribution by society, not ready to see it. So photos like this are forgotten on computers or in cameras. Don continued his search for all sorts of unexplained things in many locations, but he also went back to that particular cave many times for several years. He observed what he believed to be prints left by females and even children in the back rooms of the cave. In all, he counted 16 different individuals whose prints were left. One area he named the nursery because there were 7 stone slabs that almost looked like beds and little footprints on the ground. He cast many of them and puzzled over the cave and Massey's encounter, wondering if a freak face-to-face with Rascal might show himself to Don. He found signs that someone was raising pigeons in the cave for eggs and for food source on the ledge. This explained the dead birds he had found outside the cave, too. It seemed they could eat the eggs, then when the birds were past roosting age, perhaps they would kill and eat them. As well, Don found a couple used lighters, some stick twigs that had been burned at the tip. A large bird that was skeletonized and laying on the floor, still with bones in place, was noted by Don and Massey when they came in the cave the first time. When Don came back to the cave, they were gone. This bones in place and bones gone scenario happened many times to Don throughout decades of research. A prior time, he was in a cave with blue ice that contained hundreds of bones in it. It was all but gone the next day, the next time he went back, and what was interesting was that ice was so hard that they couldn't melt it, they couldn't chip it, they couldn't do anything with it. And yet somehow it melted within a few weeks and all the bones were gone. The cave throughout the years stayed 45 degrees, and there were plenty of bare footprints to cast, even of small feet. Whatever child was walking around the cave in 45 degrees without shoes, they were tough. Some of the prints he had also found many miles at other caves, indicating they travel, and they travel might be done through communicating tunnels. Of course, he cannot exclude the possibility that curiosity seekers who went deep into the woods might have found the cave, and others to explore the region. Still, there was something unusual about some of these hands. One print in particular looked like it was wrapped in a bandage or rags. It possibly could have been maybe a suede glove that was wrinkled, but it was definitely bound. There was a double print, too, of what looked like 2 female hands that were holding hands and pushed into the dirt near the bandaged hand. He repeatedly came back to the cave bringing items for them, including gumdrops on skewers, which they ate, but then took the skewer ends and drove them into the earth. It was as if they knew he wanted their DNA. His hope was that they might also put their hand on the ground to grab up the items and leave more prints. One time he left a big basketball-sized wad of butcher paper and then chocolate bars, hoping they would eat the candy and handle the paper. They took the lighter to the paper and burned the edges as if to hide their evidence. Later, he spread peanut butter way up on the wall, too high for any mountain cat to stand and reach. He found it had been licked utterly clean with nail-like diggings in the surface horizontal to the floor instead of vertical. In most caves he went into, he found a stone quote-unquote pillow. This was a smooth river rock like a ledge that a person could lie down on and watch the entrance. It was nearly identical in almost every one of these caves. To his shock, he had left potatoes to which they stuck the plastic forks in that he left. They did not like them. They would not eat them. But once he was done visiting, he went home to find a rotted potato at his cabin about 15 miles away. Of the 16 individuals he had cast, 6 of them had unusually long fingers, bigger hands, and he noted that the pinky finger was as short as the thumb on the prints of the 8-inch long prints. The mutation had him pondering if perhaps the cave was affected by the 1961 Idaho Falls radiation leak incident. Later on, I will make a caveat, later on Dennis Gurn, a researcher, had looked over that cast of the very long fingers and realized that it appeared to be 2 hands that were overlapping each other, fingertips crossing, which made it look like one hand with very long fingers. At the time, Don considered this concept, but he had not yet realized he had the bag from the Massey expedition with the camera inside holding the photo that Massey had taken. Massey had been so worked up from the close encounter that they just shoved it into the bag with the blinking light and the other items, and it was forgotten. Don was simply looking for evidence to back up the encounter Massey had, and to perhaps explain who Massey had seen when he was left alone in the cave. For all he knew, it was a rather not-so-hairy Bigfoot, as he had not yet caught a glimpse of the image. Eventually, he would find the camera and get it developed. But in the meantime, Don accrued plenty of evidence of who was dwelling in the cave, assuming they were Sasquatch. This is a sculpture that is a facsimile of what the entire Massey Man face would look like based on how Massey had described this character in the cave, as well as the partial photograph. In coming video, I will be sharing a lot more details on how we reviewed all this evidence, some of the conclusions we might have come to as to what and why Massey Man is in this very remote cave.